Every single empire in human history has collapsed. Everyone. Rome, Persia, the Mongols, the British, all gone. And here's what nobody talks about. They all collapsed for almost exactly the same reasons. Separated by thousands of years, different languages, different gods, different continents, and yet they followed the same script, almost to the letter. That's not a coincidence, that's a pattern. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. You probably learned in school that Rome fell in 476 AD, or that the Mongol Empire just faded out. But those explanations always felt incomplete, didn't they? Like the real answer was hiding just behind the textbook page. The truth is, empires don't die from one single blow. They die the way a person dies of old age, slowly, from the inside, from a dozen small failures that compound over decades until one final push brings the whole thing down. And the terrifying part is that the people living inside those empires rarely saw it coming. Most Roman citizens in 400 AD had no idea their world was about to vanish forever. Sound familiar? Let's start with the first killer, overextension. Every great empire reaches a point where it controls so much territory that it can no longer actually control it. The Roman Empire at its peak stretched from Scotland to Iraq, roughly 5 million square kilometers. Moving a message from one end to the other took weeks. Moving an army took months. By the time a crisis erupted on the frontier, the response from Rome was already too slow, too expensive, and too small. The empire wasn't conquering anymore, it was just managing. And management is expensive. The Mongol Empire had the same problem. Genghis Khan built the largest contiguous land empire in history, 24 million square kilometers, roughly the size of Africa. His successors couldn't communicate across it fast enough to keep it unified. Within 50 years of his death, it had fractured into 4 separate khanates that spent more energy fighting each other than ruling their subjects. But what nobody expected is that the very act of expansion that made these empires powerful is also what made their collapse inevitable. Every mile of new border is another mile to defend. And defense is a cost that never stops growing. Which brings us to the second killer, money. Specifically, the catastrophic gap between what empires needed to spend and what they could actually collect. Rome's military budget in the 3rd century AD consumed roughly 75% of all state revenues. The army had to be paid, the borders had to be fortified, the bureaucracy had to be fed. So emperors did what desperate governments always do: they debased the currency. The silver denarius coin in 64 AD was about 90% pure silver. By 268 AD, it was less than 2% silver, just tin with a wash of silver on top. Merchants figured this out fast. Prices skyrocketed, trade collapsed. The economy that had held the empire together began to disintegrate from the inside. The Spanish Empire did something eerily similar 1,300 years later. Spain pulled so much gold and silver out of the Americas, enough to fill the Basilica of St. Peter 3 times over, that it triggered runaway inflation across Europe. All that wealth actually made Spain poorer in the long run. By 1600, Spain had declared bankruptcy 4 times in 40 years. 4 times! The richest empire in the world repeatedly broke. But what nobody expected is that the solution to financial crisis, printing more money, finding more treasure, always accelerated the collapse rather than slowing it down. Here's where it gets darker. The third killer isn't invaders or economics, it's internal division. And it's arguably the most brutal one because it means the empire destroys itself. In the 3rd century AD, a period historians call the crisis of the 3rd century, Rome had 26 different emperors in just 50 years. 26. Most of them died violently, killed by their own soldiers or their own generals. The empire didn't need barbarians to tear it apart. It was doing that perfectly well on its own. The Ottoman Empire followed the same pattern. For centuries, the most dangerous place for an Ottoman sultan to be wasn't the battlefield, it was the palace. Fratricide, the killing of brothers to prevent rival claims to the throne, was not just common, it was legally codified. Sultan Mehmed III had 19 of his brothers strangled on the day he took power. That is the kind of internal violence that eats an empire's leadership class alive. But what nobody expected is that the more successful an empire became, the more powerful individuals it produced. And the more of those individuals had both the motive and the means to challenge central authority. Success bred the seeds of fragmentation. This is the part that should genuinely unsettle you. Every collapsing empire, without exception, believed it was more resilient than it was. Roman citizens in the 4th century looked at their walls, their legions, their centuries of dominance, and assumed the system would hold. It had always held before. The British Empire in 1900 controlled roughly 25% of all land on Earth and 23% of the world's population. Its officials genuinely believed it was permanent, a civilizational achievement too large and too complex to simply end. 45 years later, it was gone as a global power. That's within a single human lifetime. The Aztec Empire is perhaps the starkest example. When Hernán Cortés arrived in 1519 with roughly 600 soldiers, the Aztec Empire had millions of subjects, and a capital city, Tenochtitlan, larger than any city in Europe at the time. It should have been no contest, but the Aztecs were already fracturing. Subject peoples who despised Aztec, tribute and human sacrifice joined the Spanish in massive numbers. The empire collapsed not because 600 conquistadors were unstoppable. It collapsed because resentment had been building for generations, and the Spanish just gave that resentment a direction. An empire that mistakes fear for loyalty will find out the difference at the worst possible moment. But what nobody expected is that the speed of collapse is almost always shocking, even in retrospect. Historians know the Roman Empire was weakening for 200 years, and yet, when the final blow came in 476 AD, contemporaries described it as sudden, almost out of nowhere, because that's how complex systems fail, slowly, then all at once. There's a factor historians have only recently started taking seriously, and it changes everything. Climate. The Roman Empire's peak centuries, roughly 200 BC to 150 AD, coincided with a warm, stable period in European and Mediterranean climate history known as the Roman climate optimum. Agriculture thrived, populations grew, taxes flowed. Then, beginning around 250 AD, temperatures dropped and rainfall became erratic. Famines increased. Disease spread more easily through weakened, malnourished populations. The plague of Cyprian in the 200s and 50s may have killed 5,000 people per day in Rome alone, a city of roughly 1 million. The Tang dynasty in China collapsed in the 9th century, partly due to a prolonged drought that devastated harvests and triggered massive peasant rebellions. The Khmer Empire, which built Angkor Wat, was almost certainly brought down in part by mega droughts that disrupted the elaborate water management systems the entire civilization depended on. Climate didn't cause these collapses alone, but it was the final weight on a structure already bowing under the pressure of overextension, financial crisis, and internal division. The last straw, except the straw, was a prolonged drought, and the camel was already missing 3 legs. Here is the fact you will repeat tonight. The average lifespan of a great empire, measured from peak power to collapse, is approximately 250 years. That's not a myth or a rough approximation. Historians who have studied more than 24 major empires across 4 continents have found that 250 years is the consistent average. The British Empire at peak power, roughly 250 years. The Roman Empire from Augustus to the crisis of the 3rd century, about 250 years. The Ottoman Empire's period of dominance, approximately 250 years. The United States declared independence in 1776. You can do that math yourself. This doesn't mean collapse is inevitable on a schedule. It means the pressures that destroy empires, overextension, financial strain, internal division, the illusion of resilience and environmental stress, are not accidents of history. They are structural. They emerge from the very nature of what it means to hold enormous power over an enormous territory. Every empire plants its own collapse inside its own success. The question is never whether these forces will appear. It's only how long the structure can hold before they win. Every great empire believed it was different, that its power was too vast, its civilization too advanced, its foundations too solid to fall. None of them were right. The pattern doesn't care how impressive you are. Now, here's what I want to know from you. If you had to name the one factor, overextension, financial collapse, internal division, or climate, that you think is most dangerous for modern nations today, which one would you choose and why? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. And if this kind of history makes you think differently about the world, subscribe